Video games have evolved over the years from simple Pong riveting to action-packed open-world adventure games like God of War, Grand Theft Auto, and the Halo franchise. It's incredible how gaming has progressed since the release of the first commercially available video game, Computer Space. But what if I told you what we have today almost didn't exist? What if I told you that the entire gaming industry almost came to a screeching halt in the mid-1980s? Well folks, let's get on with today's video, and today I'm going to tell you how the video game industry almost met its end in the mid-80s. The first commercially available video game ever released was called Computer Space in 1971. The gameplay was pretty straightforward by today's standards. You're basically a spaceship flying around trying to destroy two enemy ships. You get a point every time you eliminate the two ships. The enemy computer receives a point every time they eliminate you. Before the commercial release of Computer Space, video games were mostly a novelty shared amongst programmers as something not available to the general public. The two developers of Computer Space, Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, sold 1,000 arcade cabinets of the game by mid-1972 and around 1,300 to 1,500 cabinets by 1976. The game was a success, generating $1 million by 1976, or equivalent to about $6.4 million in 2021. After the release of Computer Space, the developers Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded Atari the following year in 1972. And the company would release the first commercially successful video game, Pong, the same year. Pong was such a massive success that it practically led to the first video game crash in 1977.
Magnavox presents Odyssey, the electronic game of the future. Odyssey easily attaches to any brand TV, black and white or color, to create a closed-circuit electronic playground. Odyssey gives you all the exciting action of hockey and 11 other challenging play and learning games for the entire family. Odyssey, a new dimension for your television, now at your Magnavox dealer. He's listed in the yellow pages.
In September of 1972, the first home console, the Magnavox Odyssey, was released. The Odyssey sold 350,000 units during its lifetime and sold for around $100 around the time of its release, equivalent to $648 in 2021. This console featured its own version of tabletop tennis, and with the popularity of Pong, was both beneficial and disastrous to the video game industry. Pong became so popular that almost every home console that came out either featured Pong or some variation of tabletop tennis, causing the game market to become oversaturated. The release of the AY-3-8500 integrated chip in 1976 further spurred the downfall of the video game market, allowing a plethora of companies to enter the home console market, and because demand was higher than supply, it left a lot of smaller companies out of luck.
Channel F, the one with all the fun. The Fairchild Video Entertainment System at your larger JCPenney. The home entertainment system that never gets old. Plug in a new video cart and change the fun. Play tic-tac-toe, shooting gallery, or just doodle. Switch video carts and play Desert Fox. Switch again, it's blackjack. Or play the two built-in games, Pro Hockey or Tennis Champ. Channel F for fun. The Fairchild Video Entertainment System. Just $169.95. Video cart cartridges, $19.95 each. At your larger JCPenney.
Another contributing factor to the video game crash of 1977 was the release of the Fairchild Channel F. The release of the Fairchild Channel F marked the second generation of video game consoles, which was vastly superior to the previous generation of consoles. The Channel Fun was the first console to use a microprocessor and ROM cartridges rather than having built-in games. The technology of the Channel Fun console made the first generation of consoles obsolete, causing a lot of first-generation companies to sell their products at a loss and an exodus of companies leaving the video game market. The video game crash of 1977 didn't last for long, only a couple months. The video game crash would come to an end with the 1978 release of Space Invaders. For the sake of the video, I'm going to date the golden age of video games from 1978 to 1983. This era of gaming was brought upon with the release of Space Invaders in 1978. During this time period, the video game industry boomed, and when I mean boomed, it boomed. The total sales of video game arcade machines went from 50 million to 900 million in 1981. Just 3 years later, That is an 18 times increase in just 3 years. That same year, the arcade video game industry generated $5 billion, equivalent to $14.9 billion in 2021. The arcade video game industry peaked in 1982, generating $8 billion, or equivalent to $22.4 billion in 2021. Arcades were everywhere, from your local convenience store to even funeral homes. This explosion of growth in the video game industry also led to the overall growth and development of the second generation of home consoles. The Atari 2600 and 5200 were among the highest selling second generation home consoles released or sold during this time. Other notable high selling home video game consoles included the Intellivision, released in 1979 as the main competitor to the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision, and the Magnavox Odyssey 2. The Atari 2600 was the highest selling console of the second generation, selling over 30 million units during its 15-year production run from 1977 to 1972. The second best-selling home console, the Intellivision, only sold 3 million units during its production run from 1979 to 1990. During the golden age of video game arcades, we saw some of the most popular and iconic games known to man ever released. Asteroids in 1979, Pac-Man in 1980, Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Galaga in 1981, and Mario Bros. In 1983. During the golden age, we saw some notable video game companies either enter the video game market or cement their foothold in the video game market. Taito, Namco, Atari, Sega, Nintendo, and Konami are some of the more notable video game companies that were successful during this period. During this era, Japanese video game companies had a substantial foothold in the North American video game market. In the early 1980s, Japanese video game companies became more influential by licensing their products to American manufacturers alongside opening their own North American branches, Nintendo and Sega of America being great examples of Japanese companies extending their influence beyond Japan and into different parts of the world. Now, if you can recall back to several minutes prior, I mentioned that there was a video game crash in 1977, and that it was the first one of its kind. If you've been following along and using context clues, you can kind of guess that there was a second video game crash. This video game crash ended the golden age of video games from 1978 to 1983. It devastated the North American video game industry. While there's many reasons why this video game crash happened, our good old friend Atari shouldered much of the blame for it. The video game crash of 1983 shared some similarities with the video game crash of 1977. Market saturation, a rushed crappy games released just to make a quick buck, loss of interest in video games, and competition against personal computers all played a role in the downfall of the industry. Before 1979, third-party developers weren't really a thing until 4 former Atari employees founded Activision. Yes, the same company behind the Call of Duty series and Crash Bandicoot series, and started producing their own games for the Atari 2600. The success of Activision inspired a massive wave of third-party developers trying to reach the same success as Atari. In June 1982, there were around 100 Atari games on the market. By the end of the year, that number ballooned to 400 Atari games. Industry experts predicted that only 10% of games would produce 75% of sales, which isn't a good sign for an industry. Many different publications and journalists described the state of the market as an industry that was no longer what it was. Poorly made games were being rushed out, and just about any company could come and publish a game on the Atari 2600. There was also a supply and demand issue. Atari, perhaps the most successful video game company during the 1970s and early 1980s, produced twice as many cartridges as needed. Atari's choice of games to publish also played a hand in the downfall of the video game industry. Notably, 2 games are said to be to blame: Atari's 1982 port of Pac-Man and Atari's E.T. the Extraterrestrial.
As soon as I eat that power block, you guys are finished! Drop Atari Pac-Man into your Atari video computer system and you're playing the hottest game since Space Invaders, Atari Pac-Man. I got Pac-Man fever. It's driving me crazy. I said Pac-Man fever. I'm going out of my... Hate to eat and run! Pac-Man by Atari.
The 1982 port of Pac-Man was critically panned for its graphics, sound, and gameplay. The 1982 port of Pac-Man looks vastly different from the 1980 arcade version of Pac-Man, and it honestly looks like a dull version of the game. You can't really blame this port, however. The Atari 2600 had limited hardware compared to the arcade machines of this era, so the developers had to work with what they had. Despite the negative reviews that this game received, it still went on to sell over 7 million copies.
Hello? Somebody out there? E.T. Video game?
It's the video game that lets you pretend you're E.T., running away from secret agents, falling into danger, finding a phone to call home, and discovering the best thing on earth, a friend. E.T., only from Atari.
E.T. the Extraterrestrial is described as one of the worst video games of all time. The game was rushed and was made in a 6-week period by one developer, Howard Scott Warshaw. The game was made to capitalize on both the released E.T. film and the 1982 Christmas season. The game was a commercial success, however. It ranked top 4 on Billboard's top 15 video games list between December 1982 through January 1983. The game sold 2.6 million copies by the end of 1982. However, over 660,000 copies were returned in 1983. In 2014, excavators uncovered a massive Atari cartridge burial mound in Alamogordo, New Mexico. Excavators discovered 728,000 Atari game cartridges in the burial mound in New Mexico. It did not just carry E.T. the Extraterrestrial, but also other games such as the 1982 port of Pac-Man and Atari's Raiders of the Lost Ark were also in the burial mound. E.T. the Extraterrestrial also received negative reviews as well. Many complaints of the game ranged from being monotonous, dull, and primitive, and having a disappointing story. There were both immediate and long-term effects of the video game crash of 1983. Many publishing companies folded and ceased operations, games by Apollo and US Games being some famous examples. Many games that would have sold for $35 sold for $5 and were placed in discount bins in retailer stores. Established companies like Magnavox exited the market, and Activision had to downsize its operations during the crash due to a loss of revenue. By mid-1983, Atari lost $356 million and laid off 30% of its 10,000 employees. By the end of the year, Atari lost $536 million, and Warner Communications were forced to sell the company over to Commodore International. Under Commodore International, Atari's efforts shifted more into producing personal computers rather than video games. The revenue from home video games totaled from $3.2 billion in 1982 to just $100 million in 1985. The video game industry's viability was questioned, and the worldwide video game industry fell from $42 billion in 1982 to a measly $14 billion by 1985. While there was impending doom and uncertainty in the video game industry, the video game industry saw a recovery in 1985 with the increased sales of personal computers and the release of the Nintendo Entertainment System. And while there is a lot to go over with the release of the NES and the recovery of the video game industry, I'm deciding to save that video for another day.